Hello. Thank you guys so much for joining us at this Asian American International Film Festival panel on anti-racism, storytelling in education and awareness. I'm incredibly excited to be here and to have been invited to moderate a truly stellar set of panelists on this really critical topic. My name is Jeff Yang. I am an author, a journalist, a contributor to CNN Opinions, and the author, along with Phil Yu and Phil Wong, of a forthcoming pop history of Asian America from the 90s till now called Rise. So that's part of the reason I'm here. But I'm also here to introduce some people who you should be listening to, beginning with Erin Jones-Wesley, the co-founder of Increase the Volume. Hello, Erin.
Hello. Thank you, Jeff. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
Welcome. We also have Chris Lowe, director of Black Ghost Sun, a short film in the festival.
Hello.
Hi, Chris. James Boo, producer of the SelfElevating podcast. Hey, James.
Hey.
And then Tiffany Diane Tso, the co-founder of the Asian American Feminist Collective. I'm going to give you guys a chance to talk a little bit more about who you are and what you do, and we'll start with Tiffany on that. And also how that relates to the particular topic we're here to share today. So Tiffany, what is the Asian American Feminist Collective, and what, if you will, kind of brings you to this particular topic we're discussing?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Tiffany. I'm a freelance journalist and producer in my career, but I'm also a co-founder of the Asian American Feminist Collective. We organize and build spaces for political education, identity exploration, and community building, mostly in New York City. We do have some digital and print projects, like our own storytelling series on our website, digital and print scenes, as well as contributing to other folks' projects and collaborations, like the one that we currently have with Black Women Radicals and Asian American Writers Workshop, in which right now we're exploring Black and Asian feminist solidarities, activism, identities, conflict, and more. And as a journalist, I do cover topics surrounding culture, identity, advocacy, and policy. More often than not, I'm reporting on Asian American issues. So I feel like that might be why I was invited here.
Thank you for joining us. I love the fact that there are now more Asian American journalists who are writing about Asian American issues. I feel like I come from an era in which that was perceived as limiting in some fashion. It's like, oh, I'm not an Asian American journalist. I'm just a journalist who happens to be Asian, right? Mm-hmm. So it's liberating that we can do otherwise now. On that note, there are people who are doing it for themselves, as it were. And James, you're clearly doing that with SelfElevating. Tell us a little bit more about that podcast and what you're covering vis-a-vis Asian America.
Sure. I'm an editor and, Jeff, as you said, I'm the showrunner for SelfElevating, which is a show that presents audio stories from Asian American communities to poke at, or reveal, or challenge narratives that shape our lives culturally, socially, politically. And I guess in pertaining to the discussion tonight, a big part of this for us is we have a mission to improve representation in public media, and it's not just from the perspective of how many stories are there and what are the stories about. It's about creating resources and agency to produce the kinds of things that never get approved. And yeah, I think we have a love of storytelling, but also kind of along. For some of us more than others on the team, frustration with the history of lack of access, lack of resources, and the limits of what the story itself can do. And that's why we're really excited about working in public media and coming at it from an independent angle to create alternatives, but also find ways to work with the system, work outside the system. It's all, take your pick. There's a lot of work to do.
That's fantastic. Are there particular stories that you've been focusing on recently that address this larger question of anti-racism and how we can actually bring that into our storytelling?
Yeah, we just are now, we're really struggling, to be honest. But we are putting out new episodes right now that focus entirely on different Asian American communities responding to racism of different kinds. And so right now we're releasing stories about anti-Asian racism. One that we just put out a couple of weeks ago, I spent a bunch of time with Asian American neighborhood watch groups in historic Chinatowns. And what we're always interested in is it's not about kind of the proclamation of anti-racism, but it's just kind of the how does this stuff actually happen? And then it's often more complicated and dissatisfying than you think. And that's great. I think that for storytelling and kind of especially nonfiction, complicating narratives is something that's really valuable to us. And when you actually see someone trying to undertake anti-racist actions, you learn more about their motivations, you learn more about the walls that they hit, and you get a bigger picture of like what's going on. And we're looking forward to doing more of that.
You said just two of my favorite things in that self-introduction: agency and complicating the narrative. These are probably the two things that I think are most critical right now for Asian American storytellers, especially, right? Because as you pointed out, it's not just saying stuff, it's saying stuff that we choose to say under our control, and it's taking narratives in directions that are more nuanced, more intersectional, more intriguing because they're more real. And to that point, I actually want to go to Chris and then Erin. Chris, so your film, Black Ghost Sun, is a short film, and I had the chance to watch it. And as I mentioned to you, I did not know what to expect from the title and from the setup, but was actually quite blown away. I think that the challenge of telling stories within within racially mixed settings, within families, within kind of multiracial contexts, especially, is always complicated. But especially when you're talking about Asians and Blacks, African Americans, and I thought that your film did it in a particularly nuanced fashion. So, Chris, if you could tell a little more about that project. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
The film is based largely on my cousin's life. He happens to be Chinese American, and his son is Black, more mixed. And I was really intrigued because by his story, because he struggles with that, and he expressed to me like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to teach things to my son about being Black, and what do I need to sort of inform him about, and how do I raise a Black man as a Chinese person, and not just that, but also the inherent prejudice or the inherited prejudice that he himself perhaps was not even aware of until he started coming up upon these issues. I mean, like, we addressed the word hakwai in the film, which is kind of like a catch-all term in Cantonese to refer to Black people that has really derogatory roots. And I find that it's not always used in a derogatory way, but it definitely carries that connotation regardless. And it's interesting to, I thought about, I just wondered how do they feel about this word in their family? I know my cousin lives with a lot of his extended family, and I just wonder what the household is like. So I mean, I interviewed him and his family members for the movie, but I was just really interested in exploring the dynamic between these two ethnic groups in New York, and I think we often don't think about the sort of racism that can happen between these, minority groups as a subset from sort of racist behavior from white people, which is usually, I feel like, the context that most people are analyzing racism from. I saw growing up a lot of anti-Blackness within the Chinese American community, and I grew up having some of my best friends were Black, and so the dynamic is so fraught and challenging, and I think it's largely generational. I feel like that's sort of dissolving now, but for me growing up, it could be trying at times. So.
Well, thank you for making the film, and thank you for sharing that in particular. That's actually a really great segue, of course, to talking to you, Erin. and asking a little bit about what you're doing with Increase the Volume, which actually is an organization that's looking to empower Asian Americans to stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And I know it's something that I and a lot of my friends have been struggling with, finding better ways to communicate these issues, especially to those in our families. Chris, like you mentioned, immigrant parents or grandparents, people who don't necessarily have the same context and cultural and historical perspective around what it means to be Black in America, or even what it means to be Asian American for that matter. That term doesn't mean the same thing to them. So, Erin, please share a little more about what Increase the Volume is doing.
Yeah, I mean, you really did hit the nail on the head in saying that our organization's goal is to really empower Asian Americans to stand with Black Lives Matter. My co-founders, Kelly Chen and Lorraine Wheat, and myself, we felt very passionate after seeing Officer Tao Tu's participation in George Floyd's murder. And so for us, we wanted to say, okay, how can we be really active with this? And we found that it would be a best use of our skills to promote stories that really built community between Black and Asian Americans. And so we're starting off with creating podcasts and short films. We have a short that's based on police brutality and a lighter podcast that's really based on diverse women living and striving in modern day Los Angeles, and really showcasing that there are Black Americans and Asian Americans, both of us are not monoliths. And sometimes media portrays us as being only one way. And so to be able to really come together and build community and show that we are so multifaceted and that it's really important to have not only media out there that's going to empower and educate, but also that's going to be a positive light for these communities.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we are addressing in the larger frame of storytelling, how to actually do this kind of storytelling and still make it engaging and still make it entertaining and still make it something that doesn't feel too overtly didactic, because sometimes that can push people back. And I'm going to throw it back to all of you guys now. And, maybe let's start with James, perhaps. I just wanted to ask you guys what you thought of existing depictions of race on screen that you've seen over the last couple of years, and particularly ones that are attempting to do that hard work of anti-racism. What are some of the things that have worked for you, and what are some of the things that have frankly green booked it? I'll start with James, and then we'll go to Tiffany, Chris, and Erin again.
So I'll talk about audio work, and I'm not gonna, I think the things that come to mind for me are not works that had intentions of being anti-racist, but I think that to me, they're just what come to mind first. Podcast Ear House made out of San Quentin State Prison, California, near where I went to school. And I don't know, I guess the simplest thing I would say about it is like, you live your entire life in a culture that criminalizes Black people. And then there's a show that takes place in a prison, and it does the exact opposite. It presents Black men as people. And it also kind of is about the space and kind of showing the full dimension of like what this prison, which is not typical, I think in the prison system, but what it is and what actual life is like there. And that's just an amazing program that I feel it does a lot to undo some of the racism that we just inherit and have learned. On the Asian American side, Moonface, I don't know if you folks have heard of Moonface. It's an audio drama by James Kim about a queer Korean American working class man who is just figuring his shit out, basically. And it's short, it's really amazing, it's really great. But also there is a story behind it, which he was, James was transparent enough to share on how difficult it was to get anyone to fund it, and no one would. He funded it by himself by taking a loan, and then he put that out online the day that he paid it off. And that always, to me, is like a big important part of the story, of like understanding how it got made. And Jeff, sorry, I'm getting away from your question, and I don't want to take up too much time. Are you interested in things that I hated?
Yeah. Or anything that just feels like it's a sort of a lesson in the what not to do when it comes to this sort of thing.
I'll put this out there, and then you all can respond if you feel it's productive. The first season of Serial, I hate it, and it's just to me a prime example of a white person doing parachute reporting, but like beyond just doing it, making it the whole point of it. So it's a woman who is going into immigrant communities and going into the just navigating this like kind of imprisonment and controversial conviction, but like never ever really connecting the dots and never really coming to truly understand the cultures and the systems and the injustices and questioning that for the audience, because the whole thing is about what she thinks happened. And then she goes home.
Yes, and some people stay in prison and some people stay dead, right? Actually, this is a good segue to Tiffany, because when I think of that style of storytelling, it is the style that essentially has been enshrined in news journalism, right? This idea of this sort of dispassionate, objective voice that essentially normalizes the establishment, normalizes whiteness more often than not, and that tells people of color that they should not be telling their own stories because they are too close to those subjects. They are subjective. They are biased in some fashion. And so, even when you introduced yourself and said, I'm an Asian American journalist who writes about Asian American issues, the reason why that feels so liberating to me is because I was told, in my career, through most of it, that I shouldn't be. And I'm kind of curious your take on it, and also your thoughts on that question of what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, I think I, struggle a lot with the idea of like journalistic objectivity and like what is and isn't ethical for me to do as a journalist. I mean, I think technically I shouldn't even be organizing or doing any activism because I guess that's kind of like my bias. I don't know, but either way, I think that I am still struggling with that. And I do feel like you mentioned, feeling like you get pinholed into a specific, I guess, niche reporting. I feel like I have that same issue where it's like I think because I mean it's great that I am able to write on Asian American issues as an Asian American journalist, but I do sometimes feel like that's all I can write about sometimes, or those are the stories that editors actually are more interested in hearing me write or reading from me now. And I don't know how that happened, but I mean, I'm grateful that people want to read about our issues, but at the same time, would also like to broaden my horizons a little. But yeah, as far as the good and the bad of representation, I actually wrote a couple of like cultural criticism pieces in that area recently. So I guess it was probably in the last 2 years. One was on Hustlers, which I actually put in the good category. It's not necessarily the best as far as like sex worker representation goes, but as far as an Asian sex worker goes, it's definitely like the most, I guess like humanized character that I've seen, because there's like this Asian sex worker stereotype that plays out in a lot of Hollywood stage, on TV shows, where it's just like this very tragic stereotype of, an Asian woman or Asian prostitute who falls in love with a white person and ultimately kind of like dies tragically or like commits suicide or something, for their love, and is willing to like sacrifice so much for him. And so I wrote about how, even though the role wasn't necessarily like, the like best or anything, it still did a lot as far as like creating multidimensional narrative for sex workers and Asian sex workers. And they, do acknowledge her Asianness in the movie, in the beginning where J-Lo's like, you're Asian, so you're gonna do great, or she gets called Lucy Liu in the club. But ultimately it doesn't, like commit itself to the same tropes of Asian sex workers. But then on the bad side, I also wrote about an SVU episode, which is basically like trying to do one of those rip from the headlines, like propagandist like retellings of the Yang Song story. Yang Song being the massage parlor worker who fell to her death during an NYPD or advice sting on her at her workplace, and they definitely like revised it completely though, where the cops are playing out this like white savior, narrative where they save her, and somehow the Chinese people are the bad people who are like trafficking in workers. So that was definitely a in the bad section for me. And I think we continue to see these narratives. We see obviously like Crazy Rich Asians and like To All the Boys I've Loved Before, and what else we had. The amazing one with Randall Park and Constance Wu. I forgot that.
Hilarious. Maybe, yeah.
Maybe. And I think that we're seeing a lot of these, like, Awkwafina's show, like, better depictions, but at the same time, I think that there's always going to be a lot of these same, like, reused tropes.
It's interesting because this is kind of coming back again to agency and complicating the narrative, as James noted. In turning to you, Chris, the other thing that I'm hearing from both the people, both of your fellow panelists who've spoken, is that a lot of times it seems like the sort of work of anti-racism isn't about necessarily pointing to a moral. It is about creating context. It's about giving people a world they can live in where they can see greater depth and greater depth of field, certainly, right? To come to their own conclusions, and hopefully the right ones, about how they should behave, engage, and act as allies. And I mean, I feel like that was part of what you were trying to do with Black Ghost's Son as well, especially since, not to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it, but it kind of doesn't end as many short films don't, right? It sort of leaves us in a place where things aren't quite resolved, and we don't know if they will be. But I wanted to get your thoughts on that, and then also, of course, your take on the good and the bad and the ugly.
Yeah, I think the aim of my work in general is to, I think, produce empathy in people and understanding the characters that they see on screen that are portrayed. And I don't want to place any moral judgment on them. We don't know if these people are good people or bad people. They're just human beings, and it's so difficult to categorize people. And yeah, I feel like we just want to look into their world and have a bit of understanding, so that when we step out of that fiction world, we can look around us and be reminded that this isn't just an empty face. This isn't just X or X. I mean, like my cousin is a cook, and a lot of people in his family are delivery people, and they have full, complicated, challenging lives that I feel like can often be ignored. Sometimes, particularly with media portraying Asians or just Asian Americans, I think the stories are quite limited, and rarely do we see this sort of slice of the population. That being said, it's working class, it's first generation and immigrant families, yet a very large portion of Chinese people in New York and Asians in general fall into that segment. Yet there's so few stories that feature them, and even less so with people that have to deal with issues of race and mixed race heritage. So yeah, I think my goal is not to place any moral judgment. As far as good representation, a film that I think does a good job of it, what you were talking about, is coming out a few years ago, called Gook.
Justin Johnson.
And yeah, and that dealt with the riots in LA, the Rodney King riots. And I don't feel like it sort of did the same thing, in that it presented a tragic situation, and let the audience walk away from it to reflect. I think that's ultimately all we can do. And I think it's better than saying this is good or bad, or trying to have a clear-cut message.
I think that that's a great point. A lot of times the very complexity of these things can be flattened when we try to simplify them into good and evil, right or wrong. There's a sense in which that that core of anti-racism is really about encouraging what you said, empathy, right? That sense that we are all not just people, but valuable in this world. And frankly, that is also the underlying message of Black Lives Matter. It's not saying Black people are the most amazing people in the world. Many of them are, but Black Lives Matter is such a simple thing to be saying, and yet people resist it, right? We have value. Black people have value. That is what Black Lives Matter is saying. Erin, I want now, since people have shared their thoughts, what do you reflect on in the sort of larger work that you're doing of trying to encourage, especially these cross-pollinations, right, across media platforms, across communities, given the fact that it is a challenge to create narratives that feel as if they are too preachy, if you will, right? That there's a need to invite people into a world that hopefully they can recognize themselves in all these contexts. Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and your work, and then of course the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think a big part of our duty is to kind of what Chris was saying, is it's not necessarily about making it feel like you're forcing something down someone's throat of like you need to learn this, but really just showcasing people as they are and showing them in their most natural setting. So a show that I feel like did that really well this last season actually was Insecure. And particularly the character Molly and her boyfriend who was Asian American, and really watching how they were interacting with one another and having conversations that if you are in an interracial relationship, you may be having about, oh, how does family think about this? Or, oh, your brother may have said something that I thought didn't fit. And I think that like the more we can really showcase those conversations happening and occurring, then in real life, people will kind of be able to emulate that and be able to have sometimes a more uncomfortable conversation because they become more normalized. Something that Tiffany said actually that spawned a movie that I hope that she's seen, and if not, I would love to hear her thoughts, was Miss Purple by Justin Chon, which also depicts an Asian woman as a sex worker. And in this film, it really does normalize and humanize what she's doing, but also seeing for the bigger picture of the respect for her family and how much she wanted her father and her brother to respect her, although she was really putting literally her body on the line in order to help her family. And I think that when we're able to even humanize things like women in sex working, but also just these basic racial conversations that for the longest time have been taboo because they make us feel uncomfortable. In real life, if we're avoiding them, then we're not really doing the work of being anti-racist, right? If you don't act at all, you're basically being complicit. And I think that in order to have people feel more comfortable in taking action, if we show people taking action in the awkward way that it'll happen and the oops, I messed up, I said something, and just owning that and being comfortable with knowing that none of us will be perfect, but it's about really trying to make a positive improvement in what we're doing as a society. That's all we can do. So I don't have a worst. I think a worst is anytime we're not making those steps forward. So worst is when we're acting on those stereotypes or when we are doing cultural appropriation. And so if we see a Black woman and she's being sassy and she's like, oh, no, you didn't. It's like, did we do the work to build that character? Or are we just having her be that's what all Black women do, right? If we see the Asian woman and she's not talking and it's a guy who's being like, oh, I like my demure woman. Are we really helping a stereotype? No, we're not. And so I think it's just our duty to not perpetuate stereotypes, particularly as creators of color. We have so much power in what we're doing on that. And so I think that with us and Increase the Volume, we know what the power of media can do. And it's about really promoting a new normal of what we want to see.
Wow, that's a powerful message. And I love the sort of notion that when you're not being anti-racist, you're, essentially if you're not running, you're standing still, you're moving backwards in some ways, right? Because it's just the world continues along a certain path. Inertia takes it along a certain path. If we're not forcing it out of that path, it's going to go in the direction that we know it's going to go. One thing which I think is particularly interesting is something that Chris, you mentioned, right? the fact that a lot of times when we talk about racism and anti-racism, it's always inflected in the direction of white versus or white and people of color, right? So it's people of color surrounded by the racist white world around us. And yes, there's normative standards of a world which is defined around whiteness. That is absolutely true. But it's much, much more challenging for us to sometimes confront these issues when they're in our own house. Like Insecure, when you have conversations about race and conversations about interracial, identities that take place in bed, or Chris, in your work at home across the dinner table. And I wanted to just raise this point, we talk a lot about allyship in a broader sense, but even just having these conversations is hard. And I wanted to just throw it open to you guys to share both potentially anecdotes about challenging conversations you've had within this context about, whether it's Black and Asian or just in general within kind of communities of color, having to actually face up to the fact that we have work to do. We have a lot of work to do. Erin, maybe you can lead off a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I think sometimes living in this world that sometimes feels white as communities of color, sometimes it's unpacking what could be deemed as a little bit of self-hatred, of learned self-hatred, of denying what is your culture. And so I think that when we are collectively with people of color, and we're still in mixed company, right? So if you have people that are Latino and Hispanic and Asian and Black, but we're all together and we're able to give each other that look and say, white people, right? Like that's a collective experience that, and unless you're going to be able to say, okay, we can say that, but also are we hiding ourselves? Are we changing our hair? Are we speaking in a way that makes us assimilate? And I think that when there's a quote, which is like, when you shine your light, you allow others to do so too. And I think that that's something that we all can really do collectively. So whether it's someone who's maybe not your same ethnicity, but maybe they're still facing those same challenges, it's like, am I letting this person be who they are? Am I letting them show up as themselves? And I think that, Black people, we do that with each other, but also I think if it's Asian Americans with other Black people or Black people with Hispanics, whatever, I think allowing people to show up as themselves is really the number one thing that we can do to really help ourselves shine.
Anybody want to add to that? James, you look like you have something.
Jeff, I'm just mulling over. I know you talked about, you already asked about uncomfortable conversations, and I think in an Amazing American community context, but I wanted to maybe give a hard pitch for making white people feel uncomfortable, just like every chance you get, because I do have a range of racial diversity in my different friends and groups I have very close relationships with, work together, met through arts and other things like that. And the guilty white liberal person, this is the great time to just make them feel shitty. And if you have a relationship with them, they will take it in stride. And it's like I've been surprised at how right the moment is to just do that. Also, it's not as strategic on my part. Sometimes I just like drink my friend's booze and then I yell at him without intending to. But he is a saint about it. Anyway, I think that we often think about, like, one thing that I guess connecting the dots here back to storytelling is nothing I hate more than when you find out the bad guy's a Nazi. Because, like, that's easy. Well, that's convenient. Those guys are obviously bad. So,
whoever's writing the script for 2020 is pretty much like a little bit too on the nose. Yeah.
Well, it's also ironic that, like, we have such a rise in white terrorism and militia activity, which is genuine. And genuine forms of Nazism and whatever you want to call it, right? Real violence. And even those dots are not being connected as much. Even when they're on TV, it's still a cartoonish representation. So I don't know where I was going with that. I think that I'm pretty tired. But
yeah, no, I mean, I think that both those points are really interesting. Not least that this is a time for uncomfortable conversations. With our white friends, with our white colleagues, with one another. But I think, to your point, it is often too easy to just sort of like, you know, put the responsibility for racism on, you know, that sort of like looming, you know, Nazi in the background, right? It's like, we're going to pull back the curtain and look, there's the Nazi, you know, whether talking about in storytelling or in real life. This is something which I'm going to throw out to Tiffany, you and Chris. A lot of times when we talk about racism on a daily basis, it's not necessarily the stuff that feels like it's as large as grand, you know, grand in scale or in tragedy as the stuff that we have seen in the headlines, the stuff that has moved people into the streets. There's a sense in which that sort of constant barrage of racist static that we live in is, you know, if not equally as dangerous, certainly kind of paves the path of harm to these much larger acts of racism. And maybe that's a place to start, like the microaggressions, the appropriations, the misterms, stereotyping, the perceptions we have of one another, which are ill-informed and misinformed. Tiffany, you know, again, in your work, I'm sure this sort of stuff comes up all the time.
Yeah, I guess, you know, during COVID, there has been this like focus, or a renewed focus on anti-Asian racism, you know, due to all the spike in like hate crimes and harassment. And you know, I think that for a lot of Asian Americans became sort of this wake-up call where a lot of people were suddenly, I think, reckoning with racism in this very national way. I don't know how to explain it. Like, I think that everyone all of a sudden had this reckoning, had this like racial reckoning where they're like, oh, okay, I guess, you know, anti-Asian racism is like still alive and well today. Maybe I haven't experienced this like overt type of racism, like in your face racism before. And maybe that has started them thinking about or like unpacking all of the other you know, layers that there have, like you're talking about, microaggressions or appropriation or you know, stereotypes, just different ways that, you know, racism is enacted on us, or even ways that we also learn it ourselves, and it's ingrained in all of us since we were all raised and born, maybe possibly, or moved to a white supremacist country. Or a country that was founded on white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And so I don't know exactly, I don't remember what the question was, but I guess my point is just that, you know, I feel like a lot of people end up framing anti-racism from their own lens of like, okay, well, I'm going to be anti-racist, so I'm going to be anti-racism against me, against my community, you know, thus calling for, let's say, like hate crime task forces with the NYPD, or you know, doing like pro-Asian rallies where they erase or want to ignore Black Lives Matters or Black Lives. You know, they want to only focus on Asian victims while neglecting to understand how this kind of racism obviously impacts Black communities and Black and brown communities at, like, you know, much higher rates. And yeah, I think that it's kind of more about like, we need to reframe these things away from just you know, grappling with or pushing back against racism, but also just like understanding how it's all rooted in this like white supremacist structure that we are all indoctrinated into, and how we also play roles in that, and how we can, you know, find ways to divest from that system ourselves. Yeah, that's my ramble.
No, I mean, that's on point. I think that, you know, a lot of times when people think about how racism operates in the United States, it's not like all racism is not the same, right? There's the axis of racism that is rooted in the very foundations of America, as you noted. You know, the black-white racism is functionally the origin point of a lot of American institutions, and most of the other institutions are founded on basically murder of Native Americans, or, you know, colonization of Latin Americans. Asian Americans, you know, our point of racism tends to be very deeply associated with xenophobic and nativist sentiment, right? We don't belong in this country, according to many people, and that's how the racism towards Asians tends to be framed. So sometimes those two things kind of cut at askew angles and don't really communicate with one another. And that's part of the reason why, just turning to Chris, I mean, to see this sort of stuff play out in an immigrant community, I mean, I'm the child of immigrants. I worked in Chinatown for years, and I saw this stuff as palpable, that, that sort of sense of other worlds, of skewing, right? Skewed racisms, seem to be very apparent there. And that feels to be sort of like the backdrop of your work as well. But I just wanted to, get a sense for what your thoughts were around that. And again, around the sort of awkwardness of, if you will, kind of these conflicting senses of what racism looks like.
Yep. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. And I mean, everybody's just been acknowledging it's like there are so many different kinds of racism. And in regards to anti-racist behavior, or what we can do, and microaggressions, and I don't know if I'm the best person to speak on the subject, but it's the same thing that I do with that I try to do with my work is produce empathy in people. I think understanding intent and where people are coming from is really key. And if someone makes an off-color joke or says something, understanding if they're not doing it attackingly, it's coming from a point of ignorance, and being empathetic towards how they're approaching it, and understanding and being able to speak with them in a way where they can see your point of view, or like why this was not okay, or how much it could disturb someone that you're the ethnic group that you may be making a joke about, or and these are such difficult situations, whether it's family, friends and coworkers, people that you have to see every day and interact with, and you might make some headway, you might not. You'll find out where people really stand, but it's just that risk taking, I think, in having these conversations. If you feel so motivated that you need to take these risks, which I believe, everyone will make that call on their own, right? Maybe this is too sensitive a subject to broach for some people's families, and it would destroy your family, and then I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's just really challenging, and there are no easy answers. And I think everyone makes the call for themselves, and like, how much are they ready to be able to fight these battles? And sometimes they can't be won. And I think we have to acknowledge that too, and not forget that that's a possibility. Just because you decide to confront this doesn't mean the outcome is going to turn out the way that you would hope. And that's always the risk. I don't know.
It is a risk, but it's a risk that, without risks, there is no reward. I've had very difficult conversations with my parents about these things, and honestly, been surprised in some ways by the value that comes out of that. We have a question from the audience, actually, that I wanted to I want to turn it to Erin. I think it's a pretty good capstone on our conversation. I know we're running short on time anyway. I'm gonna, after this, kind of go around and ask you guys, kind of if there's like a particular message or takeaway or learning that you think that you've gained over the course of time that you want to share with the audience around how to tell stories in a way that kind of advances anti-racism. But Erin, the question we got actually is linked in some ways to what Chris was talking about. It's really about this notion of how we responsibly use our platforms as writers or as storytellers in order to uplift stories that are outside of our own identities and communities, right? Do we have the right to tell them? Should we be the ones who are telling them at all? And this does cut to the heart of how you can actually collaborate across communities without potentially stepping on toes or eclipsing people's native experiences.
Sure. I mean, I think a great example of it being of that working is Steven Spielberg's take on The Color Purple. He directed The Color Purple, and that's a very deep story and very important story to a lot of Black Americans. And I think he told it visually very well. And so I personally, and I can't speak for everyone, but I personally don't want to live in a world where we can only talk about our own narrow experiences, because I think the slippery slope to that is that the powers that be will then only allow those people whose stories they want to tell to make those stories, right? So we have to be able to tell each other stories. And I think that the way to do that is to practice empathy, like Chris was saying. I think it's important to listen. I think it's important to really value feedback. Make sure that you have a diverse group of friends who will be honest with you, so that if you are telling someone else's story, maybe it's a different sexual orientation than you or a different gender than you, that you have eyeballs who can say, this feels true, this does not. So do I think that we can tell other stories of people who don't look like us? I think if it's something that's captivating, and if it, at the human level, you feel it and it connects to you emotionally, I don't think there's a reason why we can't tell stories that connect to us emotionally. And I think that differs from what we look like and what our genitalia is. I think that we can tell stories that impact us on a human level. But I think it is really important that if we're going to do that, we practice empathy, we make sure we listen, and we make sure that we continuously have people around us who will be honest, offer great feedback. But at the end of the day, if we say you can only tell stories of people who are exactly like you, the slippery slope to that could be very dangerous. And so I think that we should just celebrate diversity as much as we can.
All right. And on that note, Erin, I also want to give you the first ups in terms of sharing, one thing that you think people should hear or know about practicing anti-racism and sharing it as a storyteller.
I think the number one thing, my personal number one of people practicing anti-racism in storytelling, is that we really, all of us, want to make sure that we're actively trying to put out positive imagery. That's not to say that the Nazis can't be the bad guys, but I think also sometimes good people are bad people. We're also nuanced. That's part of being human, is that we're not all just good or bad. But I think that there's a way to make sure that if we are going to show people in a negative light, that we're showing that all people can be just as negative and all people can be just as good, and that there shouldn't just be only one road to show our characters. So making sure that you have nuanced characters, because humans are nuanced. And again, just making sure that you're being able to listen and promote positivity and not perpetuate stereotypes that have unfortunately haunted media for centuries.
Thank you so much. Let's go to James. One takeaway you want to share with people.
I'm always the kind of person who wants to remind folks that, like, if you think about fighting racism in your work, you're already talking about being in a system of work, and work sucks. So, it is part of a bigger system, and it is not the definition of who you are. And so, particularly when we look and step out at the greater just numbers of, like, how do people make attempts for structural change or get kind of bogged down and stuck in it, I actually think the biggest issue is still non-participation. And I mean that in local politics. I mean that in city budgeting, all these things that are coming to the light with Movement for Black Lives, hopefully in finding greater resonance. They have nothing to do with making stories. I'm sorry. And sometimes you just have to go make phone calls, or you have to go spend time with people, and you have to gain exposure to the lived experience and a lot of things that just don't fit into what we would really like to do, which is, tell stories, make great work and things like that. But there is more to life than that. And when you are then in that position where you're getting exposed, this is why I love nonfiction work so much, because what I do is just listen to people for not a living even, but like for all my time, is I never am stuck in a place where I'm not hearing and being exposed to someone else's experience. And that has nothing to, and I don't have to do anything with it per se. I can interview 10 people and maybe only one of them's in the story, but the benefit of the 9, that's not wasted time. And it's not, it all comes back to inform what you're going to do and how you're going to make any decision that you make going forward.
You can't speak if you don't listen, right? You can't tell stories if you don't hear them. That's amazing. Chris, I'm going to go to you, and then Tiffany, I'll let you take us out. So Chris.
I think I'll just echo what Erin said, and being careful about the characters we portray and the stories that we shape and how we present them, and to be critical of ourselves in the telling of those stories, and to make sure we're sending out a portrayal of people that don't fit those tropes and stereotypes, and reinforce those ideas in people. And I am, a victim of this myself, and I'm having people check me all the time, which I am very grateful for, and being open and understanding that we may not be able to formulate all this ourselves, and you'll have to go outside yourself to be able to present the picture of the world that you wish to make.
Awesome. So listen, don't be afraid to be checked by people. And then Tiffany, take us home.
Yeah, I'll say, to echo what Chris and Erin are saying, hire sensitivity readers also, and, people, writers, crew members, editors, people of color, people who who are representative of the stories you're trying to tell. In that case, redistribute resources and funds, if you have some money. And then, I also want to say that it's not enough to be anti-racist or like against racism, but we need to push a little further for racial justice. And a lot of that, I think whenever I think about that in terms of how I operate as a storyteller, activist, writer, whatever, I think that the biggest thing that you have to do is not just show up. It's not enough to go to a Black Lives Matter rally and hold up a sign and say that you support Black lives, but to also do the internal work of decolonizing your life and your mind, divesting from structures that actively perpetuate racism, and to just really push the needles. It's not enough to be anti-racist, but we want justice. We want reparations, we want abolition. It's not enough to just reform or to try. Sometimes it's not enough to try to work within white supremacist system. Sometimes you need to create your own. And that's what I'm going to leave us with.
It's a call to action, and it's a good one for this particular film festival, which is all about, in many ways, making our own systems. And it's a great one for this panel. I want to thank all of you guys for joining us today, this evening, in your case, and for sharing such wisdom and just making available your time and your experience with the audience. Thank you, Asian American International Film Festival, Asian CineVision, for making this possible. Thank you also to the community sponsor and partner of this particular panel, Asia Society, who have provided resources to make this possible. Thank you all, and have a great remainder of the film festival, guys.